All right. I think we can start our webinar. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Sorry. And welcome to our sixth webinar. Thanks for being with us today. And my name is Bahar Shahsavari, and I'm a graduate research assistant at the Minnesota Design Center at the University of Minnesota. Thanks for joining us for another empowering small Minnesota community project webinar. The ESMC project is a community-centered collaboration with University of Minnesota partners developed to strengthen small communities through the development of resilient infrastructure. Program support includes developing and strengthening project plans for long-term goals, laying groundwork for proposals and funding opportunities, and federal, local, and state investments. We want to provide communities involved or interested in the ESMC program with new and accessible perspective on resilient infrastructure strategies. Our webinar series aim to give a better sense of possibilities with examples from professional experiences in the field and to help communities that face similar challenges share best practices and innovative solutions. Today, we present small community flooding issues with our guest speakers, Chapman and Amy Anderson, on the topic of flooding, flood management, and flood mitigation case studies in small Minnesota communities. John and Amy, you're both welcome. Chapman is the director of the Erosion and Stormwater Management Program at the University of Minnesota and has worked in consulting and research on several water resources management projects. He will present floodwaters. Are all floods the same and what to do about it? Followed by Amy Anderson presenting from local to regional flood mitigation options for small communities. Amy Anderson is a water resources engineer with WSP, and she has 15 years of experience in engineering consulting, and she specializes in stream restoration, floodplain management, and hydraulic analysis. And we will start with the presentation of John, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. Please feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question directly or put your question in the chat. Either way works, and we will address them during the Q&A session at the end. I'll now pass it over to John to start his presentation. John, please go ahead and share your screen. We are looking forward to your presentation.
All right, great. Thank you. Can you hear me and see the screen okay?
Yes.
Excellent. So my name is John Chapman, and I'm from the Bioproducts and Biosystems Engineering Department at the University of Minnesota. And I'm going to start off talking about some basics of flooding and different concepts, and then I'm going to hand off to Amy later on to get into more of the details and case studies. So let me start. I love this image. This is the USGS, United States Geologic Survey, put this together. And it just shows all the water on Earth ever. The small dot is the smaller dot is the liquid fresh water, and the smallest teeny little speck is all the water in lakes and rivers. And I just think it's absolutely amazing that for millions and millions of years, all of our water, that's it. And it just cycles around and around. And that water cycle is a concept taught to kids at a pretty young age. This is an image done by a third grader of the water cycle, where we have evaporation and then precipitation, and the water just kind of cycles around through those processes. And today we're really going to be focusing on the rain side, the precipitation. And I did one of these presentations 6 months ago where I focused more on water quality, but this is really going to focus on the water quantity, so the amount, and what we do when we have too much water. And water, we all need it to live. It has an absolute incredible connection to all life. But like so many things, too much can be a problem. Kind of like donuts, I guess, right? They're wonderful, but too many of them can be a problem. So how much is too much? It's difficult to answer, just like donuts, how much is too much. But how much water is too much is a little different for street flooding or river flooding. I'm going to start to divide those two categories and talk about them separately because the solutions are often a little bit different. And so I'm going to go over how flooding is different for both rivers and streets. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about modeling and the forecasting tools we use when we think about designs. So that's kind of up next as I get into the details. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about some jargon that you're going to hear. I should hit this early because I'm going to say it pretty quick. I'm going to say something about a return period or a maximum flooding event or a 10-year storm event or something like that. And I just need to get that out and defined early. And I think I'm going to start by having you think about dice, rolling dice, like for a board game or something. And if you roll one of these dice, it might land on a 3. And we can think about the probability of that happening is there's 6 sides to the dice. So it's a 1 in 6 probability that you would land on a 3. And so the likely frequency of that happening is once every 6 rolls. But the actual frequency might be something different. And so you could get 2 rolls back to back that are both landing on a 3. And that, can happen. It's just not likely. And probability can tell us that would happen once every 36 rolls. So you can roll, several number 3s over and over again. It's just not very probable. And so I bring this up because, probability and frequency are some things that we really think a lot about when we are designing flood management systems. Engineers have to make choices that balance safety with other things like economy. And so we could build a bridge that would last for 1,000 years, but it would be very expensive. And in 1,000 years, we might have need for a different type of bridge that's wider or something like that. And flooding and storms we have to think of the same thing, that we have to balance this need for something that's really big and strong with the other side of how often does it actually happen. And so the probability of occurrence is one of the key ways we evaluate the needs for something like flood management. We could build a dam that would protect the community from all the flooding for the next 1,000 years, but it would probably cost more than all the property in the whole town. And within 1,000 years, the town is probably going to expand, and that original design wouldn't be adequate anyways. So we have to make these really tough choices about what kind of a frequency of a storm event or a flooding event is our design storm, or our consideration for this system. And so that design storm is something that you're going to hear about a lot. And I'll refer to it either as like a 10-year event, maybe a 10-year storm event, or a 10-year flood event. And so that 10-year part of that is related to the frequency, how often it occurs, but it's really a shorthand for a probability, that it's actually a 1 in 10 probability. Just like the dice, we could talk about a 1 in 10 probability. Any given year at any location, you have a 1 in 10 chance of that happening. And so it could happen this year, and it could happen again next year. And that's just how the storms work. That's the probability of it. But that shorthand that we use for the frequency, like a 10-year storm event, sometimes it's easier to put it into kind of reality for us rather than speak of a probability number like a 1 in 50 or a 1 in 12 and a half or something like that. It's just you get kind of distracted by those numbers. So people often speak in terms of this frequency, like a 10-year event, and that can confuse people because they might think that, hey, I had my 100-year storm event, my house is now good for the next 100 years. And it doesn't really work that way. So that 1 in 10 probability would be described as like a 10-year event. A 1 in 100 probability would be that 100-year event. But it might be improbable, but you could have multiple 1 in 100 or 100-year storm events in the same year. At the same location. It can happen. And, the probability of having multiple 1 in 100 probability or these 100-year storm events happening within the same country or within the same state in 1 year is actually pretty likely, that you would have several big storm events in different areas. And so that's, just kind of how that works. But I think it can cause some confusion. Another aspect of this that you don't hear about a lot in the news, right? The news will talk about a 2-inch storm, like in the forecast, they'll talk about a 2-inch storm or a 1/2-inch storm. And that is the total precipitation depth. And when we think about designs, we also consider something called the intensity, and that is how quickly that rain falls. And so the news forecasts and newspapers don't often get into that, but that's another thing to consider. If we have say 2 inches of rain falling in the next 24 hours, is way different than 2 inches of rain falling in 1 hour. So that is the difference of the intensity, kind of that length of time that the storm happens over. Is it a 1-hour storm or a day-long storm? And if it's more intense, what'll happen is you get that quicker buildup of water. It can't flow away fast enough, so you can end up with a different type of flooding with those really intense storms. So those are some of the jargon. Let's get into some examples. So let's think about street flooding. I said I was going to talk about rivers and streets. And so most of the time when it rains, if you're in a small town, the water goes down one of these storm drains, a catch basin, and the pipes under the street or the gutters along the street are able to route that water and get it away from the houses before it causes any flooding. And a lot of those systems have maybe a 10-year design, a 10-year storm event design. And with that, designers may even plan on some of that water actually building up in the street below the curb as a storage spot, because it just can't flow away fast enough. So it may, get to have an inch or 2 or 3 sitting in the street in one of these 10-year storm events. But eventually that water will drop down and be managed and kind of stay within that confined curb to curb area. So that was a 10-year storm event, but that means that one storm every 10, 20 years might actually exceed that. And maybe some of you have witnessed this where the flood water, actually, if I animate this, the flood water will actually bubble up out of a storm drain, even if an area that you're in, maybe it's not even raining right now, but the pipes will become so full of water that it will bubble up out of those storm drains. And so that can happen. And that is just kind of an indication of that designed storm concept, that we had to make a choice, and it was 1 in 10 type storm event, 1 in 10 probability. And if you get something bigger, that system is exceeded in its capacity, and the water starts kind of squirting out of all the different spots it can. And so maybe once every 10 years that happens. It looks a little disturbing at times, but often we'll have a bigger storm event, like a 50-year storm event, that designers will have considered ways to contain that water and keep it away from more of the structures and cause less damage. But those pipes basically do have a limited capacity, and so we have to think about that when we are designing our infrastructure. And engineers try to keep the water kind of in these streets and in these pipes rather than into somebody's basement or house. That is obviously the goal. If we switch gears to rivers, flooding on rivers tends to be a bit more like the engineers wrestling with Mother Nature. When we're dealing with the streets and the infrastructure, I feel like engineers can make a lot of decisions, and they actually have more control over where that water is going and how it's contained. And when you get into a river, like a river, it's just we have fewer things that we can control. And so here in this diagram, we have a little kind of river main channel, neatly contained. And then if you had a storm event, maybe that would increase and the water will kind of come out of that main channel and end up in what we call the floodplain. And that is a natural process. If you don't have any buildings or community built around one of these, a lot of the vegetation and the soils are all well adapted to deal with that water kind of showing up every, once in a while. And the system is actually pretty stable and can be fine. We do have rivers that get modified then, where for whatever reason, communities, surrounding development, there might be a obstruction. We'll call it a levee. And so these yellow blocks in this diagram have been built to contain that water. And yes, it stops the water, kind of keeps it closer into that neat little main channel. But it also now we've changed that floodplain, and any changes in the floodplain will alter how the waters behave both upstream and downstream. And so this is a highly regulated area for any construction. And so anything sitting in the floodplain, either a roadway or a levee, will potentially make the river level higher for somebody. And so we have to be really careful about that when we're looking at a flood management system that's tinkering with that floodplain. So that said, I'm going to get into another couple concepts here in the minutes I have left. We do see changing rain patterns. Many of the standard designs, the storms that we have in Minnesota now tend to be showing up as bigger storms. We'll have bigger storms in the spring and bigger storms in the fall. And that change in those precipitation patterns have caused some issues for our communities where like I said earlier, we have a 10-year design storm. And the data that, say, an engineer had available back in 1980 when they designed some storm management infrastructure for a community, that might be different now. And the data we have now shows a different type of storm. It's maybe more intense or it's larger. And so a 10-year storm design with the data we have available right now in 2025 might be different. And that can cause some headaches because the streets built decades ago might now be undersized. And so you can have a storm event come through where instead of a flooding event happening, say, once every 10 years, it's now more frequent. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency just finished a second round of what they called climate resiliency funding to assist communities in upgrading their infrastructure to handle these larger storm events that we're now experiencing. So that is something that's kind of, in the current problems that we're dealing with. And when we look to the future, we're potentially going to have some more of that. I want to talk a little bit about planning now. And in a football analogy, a coach might tell the players to run a play that doesn't score any points, but it runs the clock down to win the game. And so sometimes it's strange not to plan to score points on a play, but it's a strategy that can win a game. And I mentioned planning because in flood control, we might have some planning that's kind of like that. It's a decision that might appear small. It might be something like saying a roadway bridge is going to be longer, and so that we have less filling in the floodplain like we have in this image. And that'll have an impact on the flooding that might happen upstream or downstream. And you may not, it may not be as obvious of flood control as putting a levee in, but it's this sort of subtle planning change of how we put structures or where we place things, even changing the amount of paved surfaces or what we'll call hardcover, that can make an impact on that water cycle and the overall water amount that ends up in the rivers. And it can change what happens in our flooding experience. So planning comes into this too with maps and insurance. And I'm just going to end by talking briefly about these floodplain maps. The federal government keeps data, and it's available on these maps for a couple of reasons. As I already mentioned, construction restrictions and extra permits are used to track changes in the floodplain that may affect future flooding. And these maps help identify these areas where the extra permits are needed. So if you own property that sits in a flood-prone area, you might need to get flood insurance for your mortgage and other stuff. And these maps are used to identify which structures sit in those flood-prone areas. When the maps are updated, you might find your house is newly located into a flood area, or maybe it's no longer in a flood area. And that could be because of a planning change. It could be because of a floodplain change made miles away from your house. Note, the insurance mapping is really for river flooding. And the urban flooding, like if we got a really intense storm that flooded your street and your basement, that insurance, that doesn't necessarily show up on these sorts of maps. So that's kind of a different type of experience and is not covered by flood insurance. But with that, I think that was kind of my introduction to some basics. And I wanted to leave plenty of time for Amy to get into some of the case studies. So I'll just end by saying that water is very much needed for life, but too much of anything can cause problems. Floodwaters have been an issue going back even to the Roman cities 2,000 years ago. And I've just kind of given you, tip of the iceberg experience of some topics on this, but I'll hope that you continue to learn more about how floodings happen and what we can do about it. But with that, I'm going to turn things over to Amy.
Thank you, John. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Says yes. Okay. Let's see. I'll share my screen. Okay. PowerPoint, yes. Can everybody
Yes.
see the PowerPoint? Great.
Yep.
Okay. So thank you, John. So John talked a lot about what flooding is, what flooding looks like, some of the things that we talk about and think about when we are designing or planning for flooding. I'm going to talk now more about what some small communities around Minnesota have done in order to mitigate the risks that they face from flooding. I'm going to define what flood mitigation is and what some of the actions are that you can complete to do that. Talk about some of the project types that are available once you determine what you'd like to do to mitigate your flood risk. And then I'm going to talk specifically about examples that small communities around Minnesota have done in recent years in order to mitigate their flood risk. So in general, we shy away from using the term flood prevention. Floods are very difficult things to prevent. You can't stop it from raining. If your community is already built next to a river, and historically there have been very good reasons for that, then sometimes flooding is sort of a baked-in risk that you face. However, you can mitigate. You can reduce the risk that you face from flooding. And FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, defines flood mitigation as all actions that can be taken to reduce property damage and the threat to life and public health from flooding. Now, what constitutes all actions? That seems like a pretty broad area. FEMA defines 6 categories of flood hazard mitigation measures: damage prevention, property protection, natural resource protection, emergency services, structural protection, and public information. And for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the ones that are labeled in bold. For reference, in emergency services is things like evacuation plans, what do we do during a flood, and public information is how do we communicate with the public, with members of our community. If, say, a bridge washes out or a road is closed due to flooding, things like that, what are our communication channels? Those are important mitigation aspects, but I won't be talking about those today. So damage prevention. This is how do we prevent damage to property and infrastructure during a flood? A lot of this happens when the skies are blue. A lot of this is how do we plan our communities? What do we allow in floodplains? Open space preservation. How do we allow open space to exist along our waterways? Floodplain development regulation is a lot of times related to local ordinances. What does your community allow within an area that's been designated as a floodplain? And then, and John sort of touched on this, stormwater and drainage system management. Does your community have a capital improvement plan or a general maintenance plan to make sure that your drainage system is in good shape when you suddenly really have to rely on it? Property protection. So this is if you have something that is within your floodplain, how can you address that? Sometimes we talk about acquisition or relocation. Can we get things out of the floodplain that are currently in the floodplain? You can elevate a building. If the building must remain, can you elevate the building itself or elevate its most critical functions? If you're going to build an apartment building in a floodplain, maybe the first level should be a garage for cars so that you don't have, people who are living there and they have to evacuate when it floods. Can you flood proof? Can you work on, can you install one-way gates for sewer backup prevention? Can you install floodgates that would close to prevent floodwaters from coming into a certain point of a community? And then the fourth thing, which could be a whole webinar in and of itself, and I've been to a couple of them, is you can participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP, to allow property and homeowners within the floodplain to purchase flood insurance from the federal government. For natural resources protection, FEMA recognizes that natural systems have beneficial functions for flood mitigation. You can protect and manage existing wetlands that might be naturally occurring in your floodplain or along your river for flood retention. You can construct new wetlands. Maybe somebody tile drained a wetland for a farm field or for a development. And if that farm field is not being used anymore, or that developer has decided to make a change, maybe you can put back a wetland that used to be there. If your river used to have floodplains and it doesn't anymore, you can create areas where floodwaters are allowed to go. And then structural projects, this is the one that we think about the most. We think about building a levee, building a flood wall, removing a failing or aging dam that might be retaining flood water so that it doesn't have a catastrophic failure. Enlarging your drainage structures. John's example was a great one of maybe your bridge has to be built a little higher and a little longer so that you're allowing those large floods to pass underneath it. And then building stormwater and drainage structures. Do you need to upsize your drainage pipes? Do you need to dig a deeper pond? Do you need a drainage larger or deeper, or having a larger infiltration capacity in your drainage ditch? All of these things are sort of structural engineering type projects that you can do to mitigate the risk to your community from flood. I realize that these are very difficult projects sometimes for small communities to undertake. It feels very daunting. They feel big. They feel complicated. Who do I talk to? How do I get this done? How do I pay for it? I'm going to talk about some examples of small communities. And I think in a couple, I went a little bit larger than the ESMC criteria for small communities, but some of them are very small indeed. I'm going to talk about how they completed some of these types of projects. So planning is incredibly important. I used to have a boss who said all the time, and this was he was quoting, I believe it was Eisenhower. He used to say, in the heat of battle, plans are useless, but planning is essential. The idea being that it's not necessarily going to go how you thought it would go, but the effort that you put in to thinking about, what do we do about this? What do we do about that? What is our backup plan? That's the conversation that's really worth having. So this is a page from a drainage study that WSB did for the city of Faribault. And in 2022, we did a stormwater study. And so you can see that Faribault has a couple of rivers, these 100-year feet. And Bahara, you guys can see my cursor, right? You guys can see what I'm pointing at. You're not. Okay, great. So there are federally delineated floodplains. There are things that FEMA says, this is the 100-year storm area in this community. But then there's also non-riverine flooding. There's areas that this community expected to have flooding, and based on the depth, where might that be? How severe is it? And so this type of study can, and I would really argue should, take into account both kinds of flooding, both flooding of stormwater, stormwater backups, things caused in your drainage system, as well as flooding that's caused by rivers and streams. And then this project, once you've looked once you've made this sort of effort, this sort of study can make recommendations for what you should do or what you should do first. Sometimes, building one pond or upsizing one pipe or building one drainage ditch can have a really powerful impact and reduce or mitigate flood risks in certain parts of the community. So you can really find your low-hanging fruit. And then I would also say, for anybody who's considering an effort like this, this is where it really should be a partnership between the community and whoever you are working with, because you as community members know this intersection floods all the time, or gosh, the water in this ditch gets really close to the shoulder when we just get a couple inches of rain. Like we see, like, because you live there, where the problems are, what your concerns are. And when you're doing a planning document like this, it should incorporate that information. And a planning document like this might even be able to explain why. Like, oh, you have an undersized pipe in that intersection, or, your catch basin is too small or too restrictive. Sometimes a really good version of these types of planning documents can really integrate local knowledge and technical analysis to everyone's benefit. Acquisition and relocation. This is sometimes a very tough one, but it can be done. And I'm going to talk about 2 different ways that it can be done. So this is the city of Brownsdale in southern Minnesota. And in partnership with the Cedar River Watershed District, they've gone through a multi-phase effort to hold water on the landscape. What they are trying to do is reduce how much water makes it to Dobbins Creek, which flows through Brownsdale and eventually goes to Austin. And Cedar River Watershed District, through their decade plus planning process and a lot of engineering efforts, has said we'd like to reduce our flood levels by a certain amount. And one of the things they said was, we want to hold more water on a landscape. We want to keep that water from just rushing straight down Dobbins Creek. This is a drone shot of one of the things that they built. So this right here is an earthen berm that holds back floodwater, and the outlet to this area is pretty restricted. So again, water is sort of forced to stay here longer than might be typical. And you can see that there are agricultural fields surrounding it. And one of the ways that this was possible is there was a land swap. The farmer who lost some agricultural, it was never of great value agricultural area because it was too low lying. It wasn't properly drained. And they said, hey, how about if we just swap you with an equivalent value of land elsewhere that's better for farming, and you can let us keep water on this landscape. And the farmer was like, well, that sounds like a win-win for me. So this is an example of property acquisition that isn't just buyouts, that isn't just things like that, but that allows water to be held on the landscape and minimize flooding risk to not one, but 2 communities. I'm going to talk a lot about the city of Champlin. I've done a lot of work for the city of Champlin. And this is a 2012 view of 2 properties that the city of Champlin acquired during 2 different phases of a large restoration and flood protection program that they just finished last year. So if you look at this image, there's a house right here at the end of this cul-de-sac, and there's another house right here. This property was sort of bisected by a road about 15 years ago. And then this road this right here is Elm Creek. And the city the city kept an eye on these properties and had talked to the property owners and said, we'd really like to acquire these properties because they're at very high flooding risk. You can see this person had Elm Creek essentially right out their back door, and this person not a lot better. And you can use, and their source for these acquisitions was the state of Minnesota Conservation Partners Legacy Fund grant. And now this is a 2020 3 aerial photos. So you can see this house at the end of the cul-de-sac is gone. You can see this house right here is gone. This is all now City of Champlin Public Park. So this is, you know, this has all been turned into pollinator habitat. They've left a lot of the mature trees, but they've tried to say, okay, now this is property that we don't have to protect anymore. And that additional space next to that river means that in the event of a high flood on Elm Creek, they now have room to like build a sandbag dike, build a temporary protection. They have more space to flood fight in an extreme event than they used to have. If you don't have a floodplain, you can build one. So the city of Mazeppa is a city of 900 people in southeastern Minnesota on the North Fork of the Zumbro River. And they have done a multi-phase project. I'm going to talk about them again in this presentation. But on the right, this is what that riverbank looked like in like 2018. There's a vertical drop, basically 20 feet high down to the river. And they graded those banks back to make the river wider, to give the river more space so that it had a floodplain where before it really functionally didn't have one. Here's a drone photo from the construction. You can kind of, and here's a cross-sectional view of what they created. So you can see there's a bench right here, there's a bench right here, and then this, you can see the gray line is the pre-project ground surface. So again, you know, almost 20-foot high, nearly vertical drop, and they graded that way back. And that blue line up at the top, that is the pre-project water surface, and that orange line is the post-project water surface. They were able to bring that water surface elevation down in order to reduce the flood risk to their community by giving that river room to spread out. Okay, now I'm going to talk about 2 more structural projects. Back to the city of Mazeppa. Another phase in their project was dam removal, and the dam removal was done about the year 2000. So this is a Minnesota Historical Society image of the dam in Mazeppa. Here's an aerial photo from 1939 of Farm Service Agency flight. You can see there used to be a lake in Mazeppa, and the dam that's creating that lake is essentially right about here. When they removed that dam, now you go back to having a river through your town, not a lake. And there's right at the bottom of that image, that's the sort of remnant of that dam structure. And they left a big chunk of it. They left big chunks of it sort of on the floodplain and in the river. And one of the things in one of the later phases that they did was, instead of just having a big rock ledge in there that was kind of functioning like a small dam, broke that apart. They took those big chunks of rock off the floodplain, and that allows aquatic organism passage, that allows fish and other animals to move through that area better at normal flow conditions, because in previous in the previous way, that meant that animals could really only move through there essentially once that dam was swamped, once it was really high water surface elevations. And removing that structure also removes something that elevates the water surface elevation. So that was another flood mitigation factor. We're back to the city of Champlin, and I hope you can all see this. This blue line right here is a FEMA certified levee. Only 400 feet long. It doesn't look like much. It has a bike trail on top of it. So it's not just a levee, it's a multi-purpose structure, but it has been built to FEMA's standards. And the result, that levee is right here, right at that sharp corner. And the result is that by creating an elevated space that held back just a little bit of floodwater, that kept it from flowing through this residential area. It's not very tall. It's not, you know, people often think, you know, communities often think like, well, you got to build a ring levee. You got to go all the way around and protect everything. And maybe depending on what your flood risks are, maybe that's true. But if you have flood risks like this, where it's kind of like there's a little finger of floodwater, there's a little low-lying area where you're having flooding issues that you could maybe cut off, sometimes a little bit of protection goes a long way. This 400-foot structure that looks like a bike trail and is a bike trail removed 50 homes and over 100 properties from the floodplain. Those are people that now don't have to buy flood insurance. They used to have to buy it because this was a FEMA designated floodplain. Now they don't have to buy that anymore. So it can be very daunting to think about flooding. Everybody would rather not. It's really scary. It's something you hope you never have to deal with, but you do have options. You can plan, you can prepare, you can mitigate your risks. You can be creative about what do we have that could mitigate this risk? What do we need in order to mitigate this risk? And it's a long-term process. You know, the city of Mazeppa took out that dam 25 years ago, and they've done multiple phases since of floodplain restoration and stabilization since then. The city of Brownsdale has been working with Cedar River Watershed District for over a decade on how can we keep water on the landscape to minimize flooding risks downstream. So these are big projects that take a lot of effort and long-term thinking and planning, but it can be done. I did take the definitions and categories for those FEMA terms from the desk reference for the National Floodplain Insurance Program, which I mentioned. I'd like to thank Cody Fox at the Cedar River Watershed District for those drone photos of the Brownsdale project. I didn't work on that one, but I heard him present on it. And when I was asked to give this presentation, I said, "Hey, Cody, can I talk about your project?" And he said yes. Heather Nelson and Carl Narngang at City of Champlin and City of Mazeppa. And then I've worked very closely on a lot of projects with the Minnesota DNR Floodplains Unit staff. They are a wealth of knowledge about floodplain rules, floodplain management, and they have office hours. You can call them up and ask questions. They are very helpful folks. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, John and Amy, for your great informative presentation. You shared information that is thought-provoking for everyone. And if for everybody who is in this webinar, if you feel comfortable, please feel free to turn on your camera. It's always lovely to see who is with us. And I can start. We have a question in the chat. I can start with the first one, who is from Tim. He asked, can you talk about stacked green infrastructure, the idea of park and stormwater systems combined?
John, do you want to do this one? I feel like John and I are like, John is more like non-river flooding and I'm more river flooding. So
Sure.
but we won't necessarily slice it neatly down that line. So you go first, John.
Sounds good. I'll take this one. So just kind of talking more about green infrastructure. So that is a term where you're using instead of like a concrete pipe to get the water away, you're using what looks more natural. It's going to be a vegetated area that maybe has improved drainage. Maybe the water will flow into the ground better and not run off and end up, moving downstream. And so those sorts of green infrastructure systems are well suited to be kind of along a park or a multi-use. As Amy's example of a bike trail on top of a levee, when you think about a green infrastructure might actually be a soccer field. And you might just have a green low spot, which in dry weather, you can play soccer there, but then it floods and so it's multi-use. So I think there's a lot of creativity that we're seeing people do with that. Another really interesting topic that we haven't gotten into is some of what we could call smart controls, where the technology exists now where we could have think of a valve, a floodgate, a way to move water. Maybe it's even a pump, but it can be listening through the internet to the storm forecast, and it might actually drain down a storage area. You know, it looks like a fishing pond in a park, and there's a storm forecast, and suddenly that park drains down automatically through this technology. And that way, when it does rain, there's more water, there's more storage to deal with it. So they drain it out before before there's a rush. So those are some neat technologies that are out there that can be incorporated into parks in so many different ways. And so I could talk on that for hours, but I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, John and Amy. The next question is from Tom. Do you have examples of incentivizing upstream owners to hold back stormwater and reduce downstream flooding, with downstream communities paying those upstream to do this?
So the Brownsdale project is very similar to that. The funding mechanism for that was essentially, that project was done at the watershed district level. So Austin and Brownsdale are in the same watershed district. So, and watershed districts in Minnesota are units of local government with the power to levy taxes. So in Minnesota, that's sort of the mechanism. It's not obviously a direct payment in which like the city of Austin writes a check to a farmer, but that's the mechanism by which the upstream community or landowner was incentivized to create, and like, I didn't talk about all of them, but Cedar River Watershed District has done a couple of projects like this. That one was an earthen dam an earthen embankment. Yeah, it is an earthen dam that they built to hold back water in this particular area. They also raised a road. Like, there was an area where, in order to hold back some water, they raised a road that was low lying. And so that served as the earthen embankment. I think it was a dirt road. I don't think it was like a highly trafficked area, but it was like a dirt road. And they raised that with the stated goal of like, this is holding back water on this side so that we can hold it on the landscape for longer. Does that answer your question? Okay, thumbs up. There are more creative sort of efforts in the works. Like, I was at a conference recently where they were talking about flood bonds, where basically, like, you know, if you have a factory in your community, or you have an industry, or you have something like that, and you have, and people sort of come together to say, okay, we're willing to invest in a project that would allow our business to keep operating under, you know, like flood conditions. Like, we're willing to put some money forward into essentially selling a bond so that we can do this project, because the return on investment for us is going to be that the bridge doesn't close, or the road stays open, or, you know, we don't have to buy sandbags and flood fight and things like that. So there are more creative mechanisms available, but that's not what was used in the example that I talked. And those mechanisms, like, I heard about those for the first time this year. Those are not in wide use. They're sort of rather specific.
Right. We're looking at the stormwater retention credit system that they have in Washington, D.C., which is another mechanism where they sell credits for upstream owners to hold back floodwaters, paid for by not so much the cities, but developers downstream, as in lieu payments. And so, I mean, there's some other models like that of incentivizing upstream owners, and we're quite interested in how this might work along the whole Mississippi Basin as a strategy that's mainly been used in Washington, D.C., but could be a strategy between downstream cities along rivers and upstream farmers to take land out of crop production by incentivizing them to hold back stormwater.
Yep. I've also heard, I don't know that it's, well, okay, so two things. One that I sort of talked about, which is, wetland restoration. You can get paid to create a wetland and then sell those mitigation credits. That's another function. Now, how much, that is useful in and of itself, because Minnesota has a wetland mitigation, market for those credits. How much floodwater you can retain in those areas sort of depends on how close is that, that wetland to a way to put floodwaters in it, but it can be used. And then another thing is that I've heard of, but I don't know of a project that's actually done it, is there is the federal CRP program where, the USDA essentially pays farmers to take land out of production. And there is some discussion of like, could that be double counted? Like, could you make it more work? Like, if a farmer is getting the CRP payments, if it's providing flood benefits as well, could like the watershed district or the county or who also like sort of make it even more worth that farmer's while if it's also providing, because CRP areas are not required to provide floodplain benefits, but if they did, perhaps that is of value to somebody in the local community.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Amy. We have a couple of minutes time left. If anybody else have questions, feel free to ask. And if not, John or Amy, if you have any complimentary comments for the end of our session, you can present that.
I can just say thank you for having me speak today. I think it's been a lot of fun being here, and it's a really neat program. So I hope that you have a lot of success helping out the communities and helping them get their problems solved. Thank you.
I'd also like to say thanks for having me. And also, I hereby authorize Tori and Bahara and anybody who has been involved with the organization of this. If anybody has questions afterwards and wants to reach out, like feel free to provide my email to folks, whether it's, I want to talk about like what grants are available or how you apply, or should I apply for state or federal or anything like that. I'm happy to have those conversations with anybody who has questions. There's a lot out there. And I opted against, I thought about like filing a big long list of links. And then I was like, nobody wants to see that. I'll just talk to anybody who wants to talk about it. So
thank you so much. I really appreciate that you shared your knowledge and experience with us today. And for those who participate in this webinar, thanks again. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your rainy day.
Rainy day.
Yeah.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.